The penthouse was less a home and more a monument to sterile ambition, a gilded sanctuary floating high above the chaotic pulse of New York City. Its air, meticulously filtered and climate-controlled, carried no scent of life, not of food, nor flowers, nor people. It smelled only of vast, empty space and the faint, metallic tang of money. Sunlight, stripped of its warmth, poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off polished chrome and casting long, sharp shadows across floors of Italian marble that were as cold and unforgiving as a frozen lake. Every piece of furniture was an angular masterpiece of minimalist design, chosen not for comfort, but for its price tag and its ability to fill a void without disturbing the crushing silence. Yet in the corner of the cavernous living room, one object defied the apartment's soulless geometry. A magnificent Bosendorfer grand piano, its lacquered black surface collecting a fine film of dust, sat like a sleeping giant. It was a relic of a different time, a vessel of forgotten warmth, a silent testament to a past its owner had systematically and ruthlessly erased from his present. It was the only thing in the entire expanse that held a soul, and it was ignored. Into this pristine silence moved Alara Vance, a ghost in a simple gray uniform. Her movements were a study in practiced efficiency. Each wipe of her cloth, each step of her soft-soled shoes, was measured and silent, designed to leave no trace of her own existence. She was 24, but her eyes held the quiet weariness of someone much older. To the master of this house, she was merely a function, a pair of hands hired to maintain the illusion of perfection. She was part of the background, as inanimate as the marble statues in the hallway, and she had long ago learned to embrace this invisibility. It was a shield. While her hands worked mechanically, polishing a glass surface until it was a flawless mirror, her mind was a universe away, a place filled with the rich, resonant chords of a life that felt like a dream. She didn't see her own reflection in the gleaming tabletop. She saw the ghost of her own hands dancing across 88 ivory keys, the muscle memory still humming in her fingertips like a phantom limb. She was a custodian of silence, but her soul was a symphony. Her inner world was a stark, painful contrast to the sterile opulence surrounding her. In her mind, the scent of lemon polish was replaced by the familiar, comforting aroma of old sheet music and rosin from her father's violin. The chilling silence of the penthouse was deafened by the memory of a cacophony of beautiful noise, the tentative notes of a child learning scales, the soaring crescendo of a student mastering a concerto, the warm laughter of her father as he guided small hands over a keyboard. These were the sounds of the Vance Community Music School, a place built not with steel and glass, but with love and second-hand instruments. And at the center of it all was her own dream, a full scholarship to Juilliard, a future where her name would be spoken with the same reverence as the composers she worshipped. That dream hadn't just died, it had been bulldozed, reduced to rubble and dust by the very kind of cold, calculating ambition that had financed the penthouse she now cleaned for a living. The memory was a constant, low-frequency ache beneath the surface of her composure. The true anchor of her existence, the reason she endured this gilded cage day after day, was the image of her father, David Vance. She pictured him now, sitting in his worn armchair by the window of their small, cramped apartment, the one they could barely afford. His body, once so full of life and music, was now a prison, silenced by a debilitating stroke that had followed the ruin of his life's work. The fire in his eyes was banked, but not extinguished. He couldn't teach, he could barely speak, but he could listen. And so, she worked. Every dollar she earned cleaning up after a man who had everything was a dollar that went toward the medications, the therapies, the simple dignities her father deserved. This job wasn't a career, it was an act of devotion. Her sacrifice was a silent lullaby sung only for him, a promise that the music was not truly gone, that she would be his strength, just as he had always been her inspiration. The weight of his care was immense, but it was a burden she carried with a fierce, protective love that had become the new rhythm of her life. The sudden sharp click of the elevator door sliced through the quiet, announcing his arrival. Marcus Thorne entered the penthouse not like a man returning home, but like a king returning to his throne room. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Illara made in 6 months, and he moved with an aura of absolute, unshakable authority. The very air in the room seemed to compress around him, growing colder, heavier. He didn't look at Illara. His gaze swept over the room, a hawk surveying his territory, his eyes cataloging assets, not acknowledging life. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and the palpable energy of a brutal corporate battle in the tense set of his jaw. To him, the world was a spreadsheet of profits and losses, and people were either assets to be leveraged or liabilities to be cut. Illara, in her simple uniform, did not even register as a rounding error. She simply continued her work, her practiced invisibility, now a necessary defense mechanism against the sheer force of his presence. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. Marcus Thorne, a man who saw the world in black and white, was about to be confronted by a melody that held all the colors of a life he had destroyed and forgotten. The quiet maid he ignored every day was the keeper of a secret that would unravel the very fabric of his meticulously constructed empire, and it was all about to begin with the smallest, most insignificant of details, a flaw in his perfect world that his obsessive eyes could never miss. His scan of the room stopped abruptly. His entire body went still, his focus narrowing with laser-like precision on a single point. On the gleaming surface of a glass side table, a piece so minimalist it was barely there, was a smudge. It was a faint, almost imperceptible fingerprint, a tiny ghost of human imperfection left behind. To anyone else, it would be nothing. To Marcus Thorne, it was a violation, a crack in the sterile perfection he demanded from the world. He walked over to the table, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug, and he stared down at the smudge as if it were a mortal insult. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He had spent his day orchestrating a hostile takeover worth 9 figures, crushing a smaller competitor without a second thought. But it was this tiny, greasy mark on a piece of glass that ignited a cold, controlled fury within him. He finally turned his eyes on Illara, and for the first time that day, he truly saw her. But he didn't see a young woman carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He saw only the source of the imperfection. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was far worse. It was quiet, devoid of heat, and edged with the surgical precision of a scalpel. He didn't raise his voice, he lowered her worth. He gestured towards the smudge with a flick of his wrist. He spoke of standards, of attention to detail, of the cost of incompetence. Then he delivered the final, crushing blow, his words designed to remind her of her place in his universe. "You are replaceable," he said, the words hanging in the silent air like particles of ice. As he spoke, Ilara's composure remained a perfect, unbroken mask, but behind her eyes a storm raged. The image of her father's tired, loving face flashed in her mind. This man's casual cruelty wasn't just an attack on her. It was a desecration of the sacrifice she made every single day for the man she loved. A fury, cold and solid, began to form in her veins, not hot and reckless, but patient and absolute. Then, Marcus Thorne made his fatal error, the mistake born from an arrogance so profound he was blind to the world of meaning that existed right in front of him. His dismissive gaze drifted from the smudge and fell upon the dusty Bosendorfer piano in the corner. He gestured toward it with the same contempt he had shown the fingerprint, a wave of his hand that wrote off decades of history and artistry. "It's just a waste of space," he muttered, more to himself than to her, an afterthought of his irritation. That piece of furniture, that silent monument, The words struck Elara with the force of a physical blow. He had no idea what he was looking at. He saw only dusty wood and unused keys. He could not see the ghost of his own mother, a kind patron who had once funded a small community music school. He could not hear the echoes of a unique, secret lullaby that had once been the bedrock of a little boy's world. And he could not possibly imagine that the invisible, replaceable woman standing before him held that exact lullaby in her heart and in her hands, a key that was about to unlock a past he had buried and expose a truth that would bring his entire world crashing down. The words hung in the air, each one a shard of ice embedding itself in the profound silence of the room, a waste of space. Elara stood perfectly still, her spine a rod of iron beneath the thin fabric of her gray uniform. The insult was not directed at her, not precisely, but it struck a deeper, more resonant chord than any personal attack ever could. That piano, that magnificent Bosendorfer, was not mere furniture to her. It was a cathedral. It was a silent, sleeping god of music, an artifact from a world she once inhabited, a world of warmth and sound and boundless possibility. To hear it dismissed with such casual, ignorant contempt felt like a desecration of a holy site. In her mind's eye she saw her father's hands, gnarled now but once so fluid and expressive, moving over the worn ivory keys of their second-hand upright piano at home. He had taught her that an instrument holds the soul of every person who has ever played it with love. This man, Marcus Thorne, saw only an obstruction in his minimalist landscape, an inefficient use of square footage. He could not see the ghosts of 1,000 sonatas sleeping within its lacquered frame, nor could he feel the quiet, patient heartbeat of the music waiting to be awakened. A cold, heavy certainty settled in Elara's stomach. This man was not just cruel, he was deaf to the very language of the human soul. Her shift was meant to end, her presence meant to evaporate from his consciousness as quickly as it had appeared. But as she gathered her cleaning supplies, a small, hesitant voice broke the oppressive quiet. It was Lily, Marcus Thorne's daughter, a pale, silent child who seemed to drift through the vast apartment like a wisp of smoke, rarely seen and almost never heard. She stood by the doorway, her large, curious eyes fixed not on Elara, but on the piano. The little girl had been a silent witness to her father's tirade, her expression unreadable. But now, with him gone, a spark of life flickered in her gaze. She pointed a small finger towards the grand instrument, a question in her eyes that her voice was too timid to form. Elara understood instantly. The child was drawn to the one object in this sterile mausoleum that possessed a history, a warmth, a potential for something other than cold, hard commerce. In that moment, Elara saw not the daughter of her oppressor, but a lonely soul in a gilded cage, starving for a single note of genuine beauty in a world of calculated aesthetics. The little girl was a prisoner here, just as Elara was, in her own way. A war raged within Elara for a long, silent moment. Her training, her very survival in this job, depended on invisibility, on never overstepping, on being a function rather than a person. To touch that piano would be the ultimate transgression. It was his property, and he had just declared it worthless. Yet, to leave it silent, to deny the unspoken plea in the child's eyes, felt like a betrayal of something far more important. It would be a betrayal of her father, of the music itself, and of the small, flickering memory of the girl she used to be, the one who believed music could heal any wound. She looked at Lily, at the profound loneliness etched into her small features, and made a decision. It was not a conscious choice born of rebellion, but an instinctual act of compassion. She set down her cleaning caddy, the soft click of plastic on marble echoing in the cavernous room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, percussive rhythm that was a symphony of fear and defiance. She was breaking the cardinal rule of her existence in this place. She was about to become visible. She walked towards the Bosendorfer, her soft-soled shoes making no sound. Each step felt both sacrilegious and righteous. The air around the piano seemed different, warmer, charged with a dormant energy. She ran her fingers lightly over the lid, tracing the faint outline of the brand's golden insignia. The fine layer of dust felt like a shroud, and she felt an overwhelming urge to wipe it away, to let the instrument breathe again. Lily followed her, a silent shadow, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Ilara sat down on the leather bench, the worn material sighing softly under her weight. It felt like coming home, the angle of the keys, the height of the fallboard, the sheer presence of the instrument. It was a language her body had never forgotten. For a moment, she simply sat there, absorbing the silence, gathering the courage to break it. The image of her father's face, pale and drawn in his armchair, filled her mind. This was for him, a single note to honor the world that had been stolen from them, a moment of beauty reclaimed from the ashes of their ruin. Her hands, so accustomed to the cold, hard feel of cleaning tools, felt clumsy and foreign as she lifted them to the keyboard. She hesitated, her fingers hovering a mere inch above the ivory. The keys seemed to gaze up at her, a silent, expectant audience of 88. She could feel Lily's small presence beside her, the child holding her breath. Then she let her hands fall. The first note she played was not loud or dramatic. It was a single, clear, questioning tone in the middle register, a sound so pure and perfect that it seemed to hang in the air like a drop of liquid light. It cut through the sterile atmosphere of the penthouse, filling the empty space with something alive, something with a past and a future. The note resonated, its vibrations traveling through the floor, through the very bones of the building, a gentle awakening. Ilara closed her eyes, and the penthouse, with its cold marble and heartless geometry, dissolved. She was no longer a maid in a billionaire's palace. She was back in a small, crowded room, filled with the scent of old wood and rosin, her father smiling beside her, his voice a low hum of encouragement as her small hands learned to find their way. Then the melody began to flow. It came not from a conscious act of memory, but from a deeper place, from the muscle and soul memory that music embeds in a person. It was a lullaby, a melody of profound simplicity and heartbreaking tenderness. It was not a famous classical piece, not a show of technical virtuosity. It was something intimate, something secret. The tune was woven from a handful of notes that rose and fell like a gentle breath, a melody that spoke of safety, of unconditional love, of a quiet place untouched by the harshness of the world. As she played, her posture transformed. The weary slump of the cleaner was gone, replaced by the poised, elegant form of a concert pianist. Her fingers, no longer clumsy, danced across the keys with an innate grace and precision, each note perfectly weighted, each phrase shaped with an emotional intelligence that could not be taught. She was no longer just playing notes, she was telling a story, her story, a story of love and loss, and a beauty that endures, even in the darkest of places. Lily, sitting beside her on the bench, was utterly transfixed. The child had never heard music like this. The sounds her father sometimes played from hidden speakers were complex, jarring symphonies or cold electronic beats, music as another form of status. This was different. This was a song that felt like a warm hand on her forehead, a soft voice whispering that everything would be all right. She leaned closer to Ilara, her small head tilted, her eyes fixed on the fluid, effortless movement of the maid's hands. A small, tentative smile touched her lips, a rare and fragile thing in that house of solemnity. For the first time, Lily saw Ilara not as a part of the scenery, but as a source of magic, a person who could pull such impossible beauty from a dusty, forgotten box. The lullaby wrapped around the little girl like a blanket, filling a void in her heart she hadn't even known was there. It was the sound of a mother's love, a feeling she only knew from stories and distant, faded photographs. Meanwhile, in his glass-walled office at the far end of the penthouse, Marcus Thorne was sealing a deal worth $200 million. He was on a conference call, his voice a low, confident monotone as he dismantled his opponent's arguments with surgical precision. He was in his element, a predator in his natural habitat of numbers and leverage. The world outside his office, the city below, even the daughter in the other room, ceased to exist. There was only the deal, the victory, the cold, satisfying calculus of acquisition. He was about to deliver the final, crushing term of the agreement when a sound, faint and distant, pierced the hermetically sealed bubble of his concentration. It was a sound so alien to this environment that his brain at first refused to process it. It was music. Not the calculated, atmospheric soundscapes he occasionally piped through his audio system, but something organic. Something achingly familiar. He faltered for a second, losing his train of thought. His business associate on the other end of the line asked if everything was all right. Marcus, annoyed by the interruption, muted the call, his brow furrowed in irritation. He stood up and walked to the office door, the melody growing clearer with each step. It was a simple tune, a child's song, yet it tugged at something deep within him, a chord of memory so ancient and buried he had forgotten it existed. It was like smelling a scent from early childhood, a fragrance that bypasses conscious thought and strikes directly at the heart. He moved out into the long marble hallway, the notes of the piano echoing softly, seeming to call to him. Where was it coming from? His irritation was slowly being replaced by a profound and unsettling sense of dislocation, of an impossible memory made real. The melody was a key, and with each note it turned a rusty, forgotten lock deep in the vaults of his mind. He walked faster, his expensive shoes silent on the polished floor, drawn toward the living area by this ghost of a sound, a feeling of dread and an inexplicable longing rising in his chest like a tide. He could not place the song, and yet he knew every single note as well as he knew his own name. He reached the threshold of the living room and stopped dead. The sight before him was so incongruous, so utterly impossible, that it shattered his perception of reality. There, at his mother's dusty Bosendorfer, was the maid, the invisible, inconsequential cleaner. Her hands were moving across the keys with a grace and authority that was breathtaking. And beside her, leaning against her, was his daughter, Lily, her face illuminated with a look of pure, unadulterated joy that he had not seen in years, if ever. They were a portrait of intimacy and warmth, a scene of such gentle beauty that it did not belong in his world. It was a painting from another life, hung in the wrong gallery. For a moment he could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the servile, clumsy woman he had berated an hour ago, with the poised artist now filling his home with this soul-stirring music. He felt like an intruder in his own home, a stranger looking in on a sacred moment he had no right to witness. Then the full force of the melody hit him. It wasn't just a familiar tune. It was the lullaby, the secret lullaby, a song that had existed only in the space between two people, a mother and her small son, in a quiet, dimly lit room more than 30 years ago. It was a melody his mother had composed herself, a unique sequence of notes that was their private language, her nightly blessing to ward off his childhood fears. He had not heard it since she died, had not allowed himself to even think of it. He had buried it along with all the other soft, vulnerable parts of himself, burying it under decades of ruthless ambition and calculated detachment. And now here it was, resurrected from the dead, flowing from the fingers of a stranger, being taught to his own daughter. The foundation of his carefully constructed world began to crack, the cold, hard marble floor seeming to shift beneath his feet. The air grew thick, and he found it difficult to breathe. The leather briefcase, filled with documents representing millions of dollars of corporate conquest, slipped from his nerveless fingers. It hit the marble floor with a dull, heavy thud, the sound shockingly loud in the music-filled room. Ilara and Lily both startled, turning to see him standing there, his face a mask of utter shock and disbelief. But Marcus barely registered their gazes. He was no longer in the penthouse. He was a small boy again, tucked into bed, the scent of his mother's lavender perfume in the air, her warm hand stroking his hair as she hummed this exact tune. He could feel the phantom sensation of her kiss on his forehead. The memory, so violently and unexpectedly exhumed, was not a gentle wave of nostalgia. It was a tidal wave of grief and loss that crashed over him, sweeping away the hardened shell of the man he had become. A sound, a choked guttural sob, tore itself from his throat, a sound he hadn't made since he was that small, frightened boy. His knees buckled. The powerful, indomitable Marcus Thorne, the titan of industry who made markets tremble, collapsed. He didn't fall gracefully. He crumpled, his body folding in on itself as if the strings holding him upright had been cut. He landed on his knees, his hands braced against the cold floor, his head bowed. The tears came then, hot and shameful, streaming down his face, the first tears he had shed in 3 decades. They were tears for his mother, for the gentle, loving woman whose memory he had systematically erased in his pursuit of a power she would have despised. They were tears for the boy he had been, the one who had believed in more than just profit margins and hostile takeovers. And they were tears for the man he was now, a hollow king ruling over a sterile kingdom of glass and steel, a man so impoverished in spirit that he had failed to recognize the most precious piece of his own history sitting, neglected, in the corner of his own home. He was a stranger to his own heart, and the song had just forced a brutal, devastating reintroduction. Alara and Lily stared, frozen in shock. The music had stopped, the last note hanging in the air before dissolving into the terrifying sound of a grown man's weeping. Lily, frightened, hid behind Alara, her small hands clutching the back of the maid's uniform. Alara's heart pounded in her chest. She had expected anger, a reprimand, perhaps even immediate dismissal. She had not expected this. She had not expected a complete and utter emotional disintegration. She watched as he struggled to regain control, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his sobs. The awe-inspiring, terrifying figure of Marcus Thorne had vanished, replaced by a broken, kneeling man, stripped bare of his power and authority by a simple, forgotten melody. She felt a flicker of pity, an emotion that was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard memory of her father's stolen life. This man's tears, whatever their source, had been paid for by the silent suffering of her own family. It took several minutes for him to compose himself. He pushed himself up from the floor, his movements stiff and uncoordinated. He used the back of his hand to wipe furiously at his wet face, his expression a chaotic storm of shame, confusion, and a rapidly re-emerging anger. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a desperate scramble to rebuild his fortress of cold authority. He looked at Alara, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a wild, accusatory fire. The shock had curdled into suspicion. The question, when it came, was not a question at all, but a demand, an accusation ripped from the depths of his ravaged composure. His voice was raw, gravelly, a pale imitation of its usual confident timbre. "Where?" he snarled, his voice trembling with a barely controlled rage that was rooted in profound fear. "Where did you learn that song?" He was not asking for information. He was demanding an explanation for the ghost that had just walked through the walls of his life. Alara rose slowly from the piano bench, placing herself protectively in front of Lily. The fear she had felt moments ago had evaporated, replaced by a strange, chilling calm. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. It was no longer the untouchable king, and she was no longer the invisible servant. The song had made them something else entirely. Two people bound by a shared tragic history, though only one of them had known it until now. She met his furious gaze without flinching, her own eyes steady and clear. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it carried the weight of years of silent grief and righteous anger. It was not the voice of a maid, it was the voice of a judge. "My father taught it to me," she said, each word precise, deliberate, and perfectly enunciated. He said he learned it a long time ago, from a kind woman who was the first patron of his music school, a woman who believed that every child deserved to have music in their life. She let the words settle in the suffocating silence of the room. She watched his face, saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he tried to process her statement. He was searching for a logical explanation, a way to contain this impossible event within the rational framework of his world. He was looking for a loophole, a coincidence that would allow him to dismiss this and regain his footing. So she gave him the final pieces, the keys that would unlock not a memory of love, but a memory of a crime. His name is David Vance, she continued, her voice still unnervously calm, a surgeon making a final, precise incision. And his school, the one your mother helped fund with her own money, the one you tore down to build your luxury condominiums, was the Vance Community Music School. It was on Elm Street. The names hit him with the force of a physical blow. David Vance, Elm Street. The abstract lines on a property deed, the faceless casualty of a profitable real estate venture, suddenly had a name, a face, a daughter who was standing in his living room, having just resurrected his mother's ghost. The connection was instantaneous, undeniable, and devastating. He remembered the project clearly. A cluster of old, run-down buildings, an urban blight he had called it in the press release. He had personally overseen the acquisition, brushing aside the protests of the small community of residents and shop owners as insignificant collateral damage in the relentless march of progress. He remembered bulldozing the lot, erasing a piece of the city's history to make way for a monument to his own success. And now the human cost of that business decision was staring him in the face, holding the last pure piece of his own past in her memory. Shame, hot and acidic, burned in his gut, but shame was an emotion he could not tolerate, a weakness he had trained himself to reject. So, as he always did, he converted it into rage. It was a reflexive, defensive maneuver, the last stand of a man who could not bear to look at the truth of what he had become. The truth was that he had not only destroyed this young woman's family, but he had also, in the most brutally ironic way imaginable, desecrated the one true legacy of his own mother, her kindness, her belief in community, her love for the very music he had just wept over. He couldn't face it. He couldn't acknowledge the monstrousness of his own actions. And so, he did what he always did when faced with a problem that could not be bought or bullied into submission. He eliminated it. "Get out," he whispered, the words choked with a venomous fury. Then, louder, his voice cracking with the strain of his shattered composure, he roared the words. "Get out of my house!" He pointed a trembling finger toward the door, his entire body shaking. He was no longer looking at Alara, the woman. He was looking at a living, breathing symbol of his own guilt, and he needed it gone. He needed the silence back. He needed to be alone with his sterile, empty perfection so he could forget this ever happened. He needed to erase her, just as he had erased her father's school. The firing wasn't a business decision. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to kill a ghost. "You are fired," he yelled, the words echoing off the cold marble and glass. "You are nothing. You were never here. Collect your things and get out of my sight. Now." Alara did not argue. She did not plead. She did not cry. She simply looked at him one last time, a long, steady gaze that held not pity, but a cold, resolute judgment. In his violent, panicked reaction, he had given her everything she needed. He had given her the final, undeniable confirmation of his guilt. For years, she had only suspected that Thorn Development was behind her family's ruin, the name on a distant legal document. Now she knew. She had looked into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her father, and she had seen not a monster, but something far worse. A hollow man so terrified of his own past that he would burn the world down to avoid looking at his own reflection. She nodded once, a gesture of grim acceptance. She turned, took Lily's small, trembling hand, and gave it a gentle squeeze of reassurance. Then she walked away from the piano, away from the weeping man, and towards the door, her back straight, her steps measured and deliberate. She left the penthouse without a backward glance. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing Marcus Thorne inside his luxurious prison with the ghost she had awakened. As she stood waiting for the elevator, the adrenaline began to fade, and the cold reality of her situation began to set in. She was jobless. She was the sole provider for a sick father, whose medical bills were relentless. A wave of panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. For a fleeting moment she felt the crushing weight of despair, the terrifying uncertainty of the future. She could see the road ahead, a path of struggle and hardship, and it seemed impossibly steep. The world had just taken another piece of her, leaving her more vulnerable than ever before. This was the moment she could have broken, the moment she could have surrendered to the hopelessness that had been shadowing her for years. But as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, something else rose within her. It was the memory of her father's resilience, the quiet dignity with which he faced his own broken body every single day. It was the echo of the lullaby, a reminder that beauty and love could persist even in the face of brutal destruction. And it was the image of Marcus Thorne on his knees, a powerful man brought low, not by a corporate rival, but by the simple truth of a song. The panic receded, replaced by a feeling she had not felt in a very long time: purpose. A cold, hard, crystalline resolve settled in her soul. She was not a victim anymore. She would not be erased. She had been handed a weapon tonight, a weapon forged from a mother's love and a father's grief. And she knew exactly what she was going to do with it. She stepped into the elevator, and as the doors closed, she pulled out her phone. Her fingers, which had so recently danced over the keys of a piano, now moved with steady precision across the screen, finding a number she had saved long ago under the name Hope. It was the number of an old family friend, a semi-retired investigative journalist who had once told her that if she ever found a crack in Marcus Thorne's armor, she should call him. She pressed the button, lifting the phone to her ear as the elevator began its silent descent. The fight for her family's justice had just begun. The journey from Marcus Thorne's world to Arthur Vance's was a descent through the layers of the city's soul, a passage from the sterile, oxygen-thin heights of corporate Olympus to the grimy, vibrant, and profoundly human streets below. The polished chrome and silent elevators of Midtown gave way to the rumbling, screeching symphony of a downtown subway station, the air thick with the scent of damp concrete and 1,000 intermingled lives. Arthur's office was not an office at all, but the cluttered, book-lined living room of a fourth-floor walk-up apartment that smelled of old paper, stale coffee, and the faint, acidic tang of a printing press. Stacks of newspapers and legal pads formed precarious towers on every available surface, and a single, grime-streaked window looked out onto a brick wall. It was a cave of knowledge, a fortress of forgotten facts, and to Alara it felt more honest and real than any space she had occupied in the last year. Arthur, a man whose face was a roadmap of deadlines met and sources protected, greeted her not with pity, but with the focused, intense gaze of a predator who has just caught the scent of a story he was born to hunt. She sat on a worn leather chair that sighed under her weight, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee warming her hands, and she told him everything. The words did not come in a torrent of emotion, but in a controlled, steady narrative, each detail delivered with the precision of a musician recounting a complex score. She described the sterile opulence of the penthouse, the casual cruelty of Marcus Thorne, the ghost of the Bosendorfer piano, and the impossible, soul-shattering moment the lullaby had brought a titan to his knees. As she spoke, she watched Arthur's face. He didn't take notes. He simply listened, his eyes never leaving hers, his expression shifting from professional interest to a deep, resonant anger. He was not just hearing a story. He was seeing the final, missing piece of a puzzle that had haunted him for years. He had investigated Thorne Development's acquisition of the Elm Street properties, had sensed the rot beneath the surface of the urban renewal project, but had always been blocked by a wall of high-priced lawyers and sealed documents. He had the corporate skeleton, but Alara, he realized, had just handed him its soul. She had given the crime a human heart. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning in protest. He ran a hand through his thinning gray hair, his gaze fixed on a point, somewhere beyond the brick wall outside his window. "The story is powerful, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a dagger. But Marcus Thorne's empire is a fortress, and its walls are built of money and legal loopholes. A story, even one as devastating as this, will be dismissed as the bitter fantasy of a disgruntled employee. They will paint you as a liar, a manipulator, an opportunist. We can't just wound him with the truth. We have to slay him with facts. We need something cold, hard, and undeniable. We need a paper trail that leads from his hand to your father's ruin. We need proof of a crime, not just of a sin." He was laying out the brutal reality of their fight, not to discourage her, but to forge her resolve in the fire of truth. He needed her to understand that this was no longer about a song, it was about a war. And so, the hunt began. The days that followed blurred into a grueling marathon of methodical, painstaking research. Elara's life became a cycle of caring for her father in the quiet, sunlit hours of the morning, and then descending into the dusty, fluorescent-lit underworld of city archives with Arthur in the afternoons. The hushed halls, filled with the dry, papery scent of decaying history, became their new sanctuary. They spent countless hours hunched over microfilm readers, the ghostly green text scrolling past their tired eyes, searching for anomalies in zoning variances and property transfer deeds. They combed through years of financial disclosures, tax records, and incorporation filings, looking for a single thread to pull, a single name that would connect Thorne's polished corporate facade to the shadowy shell companies that had bought up the Elm Street properties for pennies on the dollar before the redevelopment was announced. It was tedious, soul-crushing work, a search for a single corrupt number in a universe of legitimate ones. Elara discovered a strange synergy between her past life and her present mission. The same discipline that had allowed her to master a Rachmaninoff concerto, the ability to see the overarching structure within thousands of individual notes, now allowed her to spot patterns in the dense, legalistic jargon of the city's bureaucracy. Her hands, which once knew the precise pressure needed for a pianissimo passage, now learned the delicate touch required to handle brittle, century-old documents. She was a musician in a library of law, listening for a discordant note. The frustration was immense. For every promising lead, they would hit a dead end, a legal firewall constructed by Thorne's army of lawyers, designed specifically to make his actions untraceable. The shell companies were registered in Delaware, their ownership obscured behind impenetrable layers of corporate veiling. It felt like punching a ghost. Doubt began to creep in, a cold whisper in the late hours of the night, telling her that Thorne was too smart, too powerful, too insulated to ever be touched. The breakthrough came not with a bang, but with a whisper of memory. It was late one evening, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes in a dusty municipal storage annex, that Elara found a box of community hearing transcripts from the Elm Street rezoning debate. As she read the faded print, she saw the names of her father's neighbors, small business owners, their voices filled with a desperate, futile anger as they protested the seizure of their properties. Then she saw a name that made the air freeze in her lungs: Ethelred Holdings, LLC. It was the primary entity that had acquired the land. The name was meaningless on its own, but it triggered a flicker of a memory, a fragment of a conversation she had overheard between two of Thorne's executives in the penthouse. They had been laughing about their boss's pretentious new hobby of collecting rare Anglo-Saxon historical texts. Ethelred, the name of an old English king. It was a piece of trivia, a sliver of corporate banter, but in this context it felt like a key. Thorne, in his monumental arrogance, had named his predatory shell company after a historical footnote he admired. Arthur saw the significance immediately. It was not legal proof, not yet, but it was the first direct, personal link between Thorne's mind and the mechanism of the crime. It was a thread of vanity, and they both knew that a man's vanity was often the unraveling of him. Arthur used his old contacts, calling in favors from financial journalists and retired fraud investigators. They began to trace the money, a complex and deliberately confusing path that snaked through offshore accounts and back again. They discovered that Ethelred Holdings had been funded by another entity, which was funded by another, a dizzying chain of corporate nesting dolls. But with the name as their starting point, they could follow the scent. They worked relentlessly, fueled by black coffee and a shared, cold fury. Ilara felt the last vestiges of her grief burning away, replaced by the white-hot focus of a hunter closing in on its prey. She was no longer just her father's daughter, she was his avenger. The paper trail, however, only took them so far. It proved that Thorne's corporate ecosystem was behind the acquisitions. But it didn't prove the illegal tactics used to force the sales. The official record showed voluntary transactions. They knew, from the community hearing transcripts, that the reality was different. Residents had been pressured, intimidated, and harassed by a sudden plague of building code violations, tax audits, and frivolous legal challenges that bled them dry until they had no choice but to sell. To prove this, they needed more than paper. They needed a human source. They needed someone from the inside, someone who had witnessed Thorne's methods firsthand and was willing to talk. This, Arthur warned her, was the most dangerous part of the hunt. They were no longer just digging through the past. They were threatening the present, and a man like Thorne did not hesitate to crush any threat to his power. Ilara's mind went back to the penthouse, to the hushed conversations and resentful whispers she had overheard among the other household staff. She had been invisible, a ghost in a gray uniform, and in their carelessness, people had spoken freely around her. She remembered the name of Thorne's former chief operating officer, a man named Robert Henderson, who had been abruptly and brutally fired about a year ago, shortly after the Elm Street project was completed. The official story was a corporate restructuring, but the gossip among the staff was that Henderson had a crisis of conscience, that he had pushed back against Thorne on an ethical matter and had been surgically removed from the company as a result. He had been given a generous severance package, tied to an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, a golden cage to ensure his silence. Finding him and convincing him to break that silence became their new, all-consuming objective. Finding Robert Henderson was like trying to find a man who had intentionally erased himself from the world. He was no longer in the city, his lavish apartment sold, his name removed from every social and professional directory. It took Arthur weeks of calling old sources and pulling strings just to find a possible location. A small, unassuming town in upstate New York, a place where people went to be forgotten. They drove there on a crisp autumn day, the vibrant colors of the fall foliage, a stark contrast to the grim nature of their mission. They found Henderson living in a modest suburban house, a pale imitation of his former life. When he opened the door, Ilara saw not a corporate titan, but a man haunted by his own compromises. His eyes were shadowed with a deep weariness, and a tremor of fear passed over his face when Arthur introduced himself as a journalist. He tried to shut the door, to retreat back into the quiet, gilded prison of his silence, citing his NDA, his fear of Thorne's retribution. It was Ilara who stopped him. She stepped forward, and she did not speak of justice or corporate malfeasance. She spoke of her father. She pulled out her phone and showed Henderson a picture of David Vance, not the broken man in the armchair, but a photo from before, standing in the middle of his music school, surrounded by smiling children holding violins and cellos. "This is what he took," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "He didn't just take a building, Mr. Henderson. He took this. He took the music. He took my father's life." She then told him about the lullaby, about the moment in the penthouse, about Thorne weeping on the marble floor. She painted a picture not of a powerful CEO, but of a broken man, a man so disconnected from his own humanity that he had to have it played back to him by the daughter of a man he had destroyed. She wasn't asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to help reclaim a piece of a world that Thorne had tried to erase. A change came over Henderson's face as he listened. The fear was still there, but something else was dawning in his eyes. a flicker of his own buried conscience, a memory of the man he had been before he had made his deal with the devil. He looked at the photograph of the music school, and then back at Ilara, and he saw a path to a redemption he had long ago given up on. He invited them inside. His house was sparsely furnished, the air thick with the silence of a man living with his ghosts. He told them that his NDA was unbreakable, that any document he had would be inadmissible, and would only lead to his financial ruin. Thorne was too smart to leave a paper trail of his illegal orders, but, Henderson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, Thorne had one fatal flaw: his ego. He was so proud of his own ruthless strategies that he liked to hear himself talk about them. Henderson explained that during the most aggressive phase of the Elm Street acquisition, Thorne had called a private, off-the-books meeting with his core team. In that meeting, he had laid out in explicit detail the strategy of manufactured distress. He had bragged about using a network of contacts within city inspection agencies to fabricate violations, and a team of lawyers to bury small landowners in frivolous lawsuits until they were financially and emotionally broken. And in his supreme arrogance, Thorne had ordered the meeting to be recorded, for internal training purposes, he had claimed, but really as a monument to his own brutal genius. The recording was a digital file, Henderson explained, likely buried deep within the encrypted archives of Thorne's personal server at the corporate headquarters. It was the smoking gun. It was Thorne, in his own voice, confessing to his crimes. Finding it was impossible, he said. The server was a digital fortress. But as he spoke, a cold, clear certainty washed over Ilara. A digital fortress, perhaps, but one whose physical space she knew intimately. She knew the cleaning schedules, the security guard rotations, the blind spots in the camera coverage. More than that, she remembered something. The head of Thorne's personal IT security, a young, cocky technician named Ben, was an avid classical music aficionado. During a late-night system maintenance, while she was quietly cleaning the server room, she had overheard him complaining to a colleague about password protocols. He'd mentioned that his own unbreakable password hint was his favorite piece, the one he considered the most technically challenging ever written. He had even hummed a few bars. Ilara, the former Juilliard prodigy, had recognized it instantly. It was Liszt's La Campanella. It was a detail so small, so insignificant, that it never would have registered to anyone else. But to her, it was a key. It was another piece of Thorne's world, his vanity and arrogance, providing the very tools of his own destruction. The final pieces of the plan began to slot into place with a terrifying, exhilarating speed. Arthur would use his connections to leak a minor but distracting story about a different Thorne development project, something that would send the company's PR and legal teams into a controlled panic, drawing all eyes, especially security, to that fire. During that window of manufactured chaos, Ilara would use a borrowed keycard from a sympathetic kitchen staff member she had befriended to gain access to the executive floor. She would navigate to the IT office, a place rarely occupied during a PR crisis, and use the technician's terminal. She would log in using his name, and the password she was now certain was some variation of La Campanella. From there, guided by Henderson's knowledge of the server's file architecture, she would locate the audio file, download it to a concealed, encrypted drive, and walk out, becoming a ghost in a gray uniform one last time. The risk was astronomical. If she was caught, it wouldn't just be a firing, it would be corporate espionage, a serious crime. Thorne would not just sue her, he would crush her, bury her under the full weight of his legal machine. She and Arthur sat in his cluttered office, the plan laid out between them like a battle map. He looked at her, his expression grave. "You don't have to do this, Ilara," he said. "We can find another way." But she shook her head, her resolve as hard and clear as a diamond. "There is no other way," she replied, her voice steady. "He built his kingdom by treating people like they were invisible. He won't see me coming because he never saw me in the first place. My invisibility is my weapon." It was the final, perfect irony. The very quality he had despised in her, The thing he had used to humiliate her was now the instrument of his downfall. The stage was now set for the final act. Henderson's testimony, corroborated by the audio recording, would be irrefutable. But a quiet press release or a lawsuit filed in the dead of night was not enough. The justice had to be as public and as devastating as the crime had been secret and insidious. Arthur, through a contact at the city's Arts Council, secured 2 tickets to the upcoming New York Philanthropic Leadership Gala. It was the premier charity event of the year, a night where the city's wealthiest and most powerful gathered to celebrate themselves. And this year, the man of the hour, the recipient of the prestigious Philanthropist of the Year award for his visionary urban renewal projects, was Marcus Thorne. He would be on a stage, in a room full of his peers, the media, and the city's elite, accepting an award for the very crime that had destroyed her family. It was a stage built on a foundation of lies, and Alara was going to burn it to the ground. In her small apartment, late on the night before the gala, Alara held the small, cold flash drive in her hand. It felt impossibly heavy, a single object containing the weight of her family's past and the hope of their future. The file was downloaded, the plan was in motion, the trap was set. She walked over to her father's armchair, where he sat sleeping, his breathing soft and even. A copy of a Beethoven sonata lay open on his lap, a relic from a life he could no longer lead. She looked at his peaceful face, the lines of worry and pain smoothed away in sleep, and she felt a profound, aching love. She knelt beside him and gently took his hand, his fingers, once so strong and nimble on the piano keys, now resting limply in hers. A silent promise passed from her to him. The lullaby had been the beginning, a melody of grief that had awakened a monster. But the performance tomorrow night, she vowed, would be the finale. The final note of this symphony is for you, Dad, and it will be a crescendo of absolute justice. The grand ballroom at Cipriani Wall Street was a universe unto itself, a gilded cosmos where power and money orbited each other in a slow, elegant dance. Crystal chandeliers, vast as frozen nebulas, dripped light onto a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, rare orchids, and the subtle, metallic tang of ambition. The sound was a carefully orchestrated symphony of polite laughter, the clinking of champagne flutes, and the low, constant murmur of influence being traded like currency. At the center of this galaxy of wealth stood Marcus Thorne, bathed in the warm glow of a spotlight, a golden trophy clutched in his hand. He was at the apex of his world, accepting the Philanthropist of the Year award, a monument to his own self-conception as a builder of cities, a visionary of progress. He spoke of legacy, of shaping the future, his voice smooth and confident, each word a polished stone laid upon the foundation of his empire. He was invincible, untouchable, a king addressing his court from a throne of public adoration. Alara watched him from the shadows at the back of the ballroom, her heart a steady, powerful drum against her ribs. She was not a maid tonight. She wore a simple, dark blue dress, elegant in its understatement, a garment that allowed her to blend in while reclaiming her own identity. Beside her, Arthur gave her hand a final, reassuring squeeze, his eyes, filled with a fierce paternal pride, fixed on the stage. This was not an act of revenge. It was a rebalancing of the scales, a final, necessary chord in a symphony of justice that had been waiting decades to be played. As Marcus Thorne paused for a dramatic effect, preparing to deliver the final, self-aggrandizing lines of his speech, a new sound entered the room. It was faint at first, a single clear piano note that seemed to materialize from the very air. A few heads turned, assuming it was a technical glitch in the sound system, a feedback squeal from a microphone. Thorne himself faltered, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at the unprofessional interruption. Then another note followed, and another, weaving together into a melody of heartbreaking simplicity. It was the lullaby. It was not a recording played through speakers. It was a live feed, piped in by Arthur's contact in the audio-visual booth, the sound pure and resonant, as if the ghost of the Bosendorfer itself had followed them into this hallowed hall. The gentle notes cut through the opulent noise of the ballroom, a sound so intimate and pure that it felt utterly alien in this place of calculated grandeur. The murmur of the crowd began to die down, replaced by a confused, listening silence. On the stage, the blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face. His confident smile froze, then cracked, his eyes widening in a dawning, animalistic panic. He recognized the song not just in his mind, but in his very bones. It was the sound of his own buried heart, and it had no place here. Then, the massive screen behind him, which had been displaying the Thorne Development logo in shimmering gold, flickered and changed. The corporate branding dissolved, replaced by a soft, sepia-toned photograph of a young, smiling woman with kind eyes, her arm wrapped around a small, serious-looking boy. It was his mother. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. They were not just seeing a CEO, they were seeing a son. Before the shock could settle, the image dissolved again, replaced by a vibrant color photograph of a small brick building, a hand-painted sign above the door reading Vance Community Music School. The photo was filled with life, with children of all ages holding instruments, their faces alight with the joy of creation. At the center of the group stood a proud, beaming David Vance. Then, with brutal cinematic timing, that image was replaced by another. The same building, now a pile of rubble and twisted steel, a single, splintered violin lying half-buried in the dust. The story was told in 3 silent, devastating images. The love that had inspired the legacy that was built, and the man on the stage who had destroyed it all. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of disbelief and dawning horror. Marcus Thorne stumbled back from the podium, his hand flying to his chest as if to stop his heart from beating its way out. It was into this cathedral of stunned silence that Alara began to walk. Her steps were not rushed, but deliberate and measured, each one an act of profound and terrifying courage. The sea of powerful figures parted before her, as if she were a ship cutting through a frozen ocean. All eyes were on her, this unknown woman, moving with an impossible purpose toward the center of their universe. In her mind, the faces of the crowd blurred into an indistinct sea. She saw only one thing: her father, sitting in his worn armchair by the window, his gaze distant, listening to a music only he could hear. This walk, this final terrifying journey, was for him. She was carrying his stolen voice, his shattered life, up onto this stage, to lay it at the feet of the man who had broken him. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a fire that burned it away. She was no longer Alara Vance, the invisible maid. She was the daughter of David Vance, the keeper of the music. And she was the living, breathing consequence of Marcus Thorne's ambition. She reached the stage, ascended the small set of stairs, and walked directly to the podium, her gaze never leaving Thorne's terrified, uncomprehending face. She took the microphone, her hand steady, her grip firm. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was quiet, yet it filled every corner of the vast, silent room, amplified into a sound of irrefutable truth. "My name is Alara Vance," she began, her words clear and precise. "The man you are honoring tonight, Marcus Thorne, is a visionary. He sees a plot of land and envisions a tower of glass and steel. But what he does not see, what he cannot see, are the lives he must bulldoze to build his monuments." She paused, letting her words sink in. "That lullaby you just heard," she continued, her voice softening with a deep, resonant sorrow, "was written by his mother. It was a song of love and protection. She was a kind woman who believed that music could save a child's soul. So she used her own money to help a young teacher, my father, David Vance, build a small music school on Elm Street, the building you just saw in ruins. She taught my father the lullaby, and he, in turn, taught it to me. It was the last piece of her legacy on this earth. And the man she sang it to, her own son, is the man who tore it down. She exposed him not with rage, but with the heartbreaking, irrefutable poetry of his own hypocrisy. She told them everything. The hostile acquisition, the manufactured code violations, the destruction of a community, and the stroke that had silenced her father. She ended by looking directly into the lens of a news camera, her voice now a blade of cold, hard steel. "This award is a monument," she said, "but it is a monument built on the rubble of my father's life." The downfall was not a slow decline. It was a catastrophic implosion, a star collapsing in on itself. As Ilara finished speaking, a roar of noise erupted in the ballroom. It was the frantic clicking of 100 cameras, the shouted questions of reporters, the horrified, excited whispers of the city's elite, who could smell the blood of a fallen titan. Marcus Thorne stood frozen, a statue of guilt, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. The golden trophy slipped from his nerveless fingers and fell to the stage with a dull, hollow clang. The sound seemed to break the spell. He looked around wildly, his eyes searching for an ally, a friendly face, but he saw only condemnation, fascination, and the cold, hard judgment of his peers. The men who had shaken his hand an hour ago now turned their backs, distancing themselves from the toxic fallout. His world, built on the illusion of power and respect, had evaporated in the space of 5 minutes. He was no longer a philanthropist. He was a ghoul, a man who had devoured his own mother's legacy for profit. He stumbled backward, tripping over a cable, and fell to his knees, the same pathetic, crumpled heap he had been on his own marble floor. But this time, the whole world was watching. The king was naked, his castle of lies demolished, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone on a stage of his own making. What was the most satisfying moment of Marcus Thorne's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Ilara finally exposed the truth. How did that final confrontation make you feel? Share your reaction with us below. The weeks that followed the gala were a cascade of consequences, each one another nail in the coffin of Marcus Thorne's empire. The story was a media firestorm, a perfect narrative of hubris and retribution that the city could not get enough of. Arthur's meticulously researched exposé, now anchored by Ilara's irrefutable testimony and Henderson's leaked audio file of Thorne bragging about his crimes, was published and went viral. The district attorney's office launched a full-scale investigation into Thorne Development's business practices, uncovering years of fraud, coercion, and corruption. Shareholders revolted, the stock price plummeted into oblivion, and the board of directors, in a desperate act of self-preservation, ousted him from the company he had built. He was left with nothing but his legal bills, and the hollow echo of his own public disgrace, a man drowned by a past he had tried so desperately to bury. His sterile penthouse, once a symbol of his power, became a gilded prison, the silent Bosendorfer in the corner, a constant mocking reminder of the soul he had sold and the love he had desecrated. The justice was not just legal, it was poetic, absolute, and complete. Ilara did not watch his empire burn. She had turned her back on the ashes and walked toward the light. In the audience at the gala that night had been a woman named Eleanor Covington, the head of the city's most prestigious arts foundation and a contemporary of Marcus Thorne's mother. Moved to tears by Ilara's story and stunned by the raw, undeniable talent she represented, she had sought Ilara out. It wasn't a handout or an act of charity. It was an investment in the belief that art was more powerful than greed, that a single melody could rebuild a world that a bulldozer had destroyed. With a substantial multi-million-dollar grant from the foundation, Ilara was given the resources to not just rebuild what was lost, but to create something even greater. She worked with a quiet, fierce determination, pouring all of her love, her grief, and her hope into the project. She was no longer just a musician. She was an architect of dreams, a builder of sanctuaries, just as her father had been. The David Vance Conservatory of Music opened its doors 1 year to the day after the gala. It was not a small, cramped building on a forgotten street, but a state-of-the-art facility in the heart of the city, its glass walls designed not to be cold and sterile, but to let the light pour in. The lobby was filled with the cacophony of beautiful noise, the tentative notes of a child learning scales, the soaring crescendo of a student mastering a concerto, the warm laughter of teachers guiding small hands. At the center of the lobby, on a raised platform, sat a magnificent Bosendorfer grand piano, a gift from an anonymous donor, which everyone knew was Eleanor Covington. Alara stood beside her father, who sat in his wheelchair, his body still frail but his eyes, for the first time in years, shining with an unclouded, brilliant light. He could not speak, but he reached out a trembling hand and placed it on her arm, his touch conveying a universe of love and pride. She had not just won him justice, she had given him back his legacy, immortalizing his name not as a victim, but as an inspiration. Ilara looked at the vibrant, noisy, beautiful world she had built from the ashes of her pain, and she knew her work was complete. The lullaby had come home. If Ilara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you believe that courage and truth can change the world, help us spread that message by giving this video a like and sending it to a friend. To make sure you don't miss our next story of righteous revenge, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell.